Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Ronnie Feldman for another episode of Creativity and Compliance. Welcome back, Ronnie.
Hey, Tom, how are you?
Ronnie, even my wife has suggested I am obsessing over Boeing and the DOJ's proposal for a monitorship. But I've really been wanting to visit with you about this topic to kind of get your angle on this, how, which is how do you take a completely broken, toxic culture and turn it around using the tactics, tools, and skills you and your team bring to bear? I recognize there are a lot in there, but what would you do from your perspective if asked to come in and help at least start turn Boeing around?
Yeah. So the big question, here's how my reaction to that. It's a perfect example of how a company has all the right tools and resources in place. They got tons of compliance officers. They do lots of training, and it meant nothing because they had. Again, I'm hesitant to just cast blame specific on them because I haven't researched their specific issue enough. So to take this in the conceptual standpoint, they do lots of training. They have lots of compliance officers, yet they have this culture of, of speak up that isn't there because people didn't trust the support system in place, right? They didn't feel like they could speak up and say something. Do you remember back in the Wells Fargo thing? How many compliance officers did they have? Like thousands. And yet right under their noses, like this whole culture was happening of them making those phony accounts for people. And this gets at the heart of everything that you and I have been talking about. When I started learning entertainment, the whole idea was based on the fact that ethics compliance is doing things bass backwards, which is we focus on training and controls, and that training tends to be boring and preachy and negatively impacts the culture because they think you're just pushing liability on them and you don't care. And they think you don't care because you make them do this terrible click trading, and uh, it doesn't work. And companies approach me all the time. They're like, how can you show that being fun and interesting is a more effective solution? And I'm like, just because it makes perfect sense logically. We all know that if you do things that are boring and preachy, people do not speak up and they resent you for it. So with that little rant aside, the way I think you have to address this is to really take a step back and go, what's the problem we're solving? The first thing we should be doing is focusing on a culture where people feel supported. That's more important than knowing the rules. And I know we got to talk about how to measure that. Fine. Let's not do the thing that's easy to measure that doesn't work and then show that we didn't measure things. Let's focus on the tip of the iceberg, making people feel like they're part of an organization where they feel supported, psychologically safe, and they can speak up to post problems. The way you do that, gosh, there's lots of ways. You and I have talked about branding. If you're trying to change a culture that's toxic or bad, or maybe they're just tuning you out, one way is marketing 101. Got a bad brand, change it. So you and I have talked about a lot. I have a lot of clients more and more. It seems to be a fun, interesting trend where we're changing the name of the department to something more positive and helpful. That's not compliance, which for those who are just listening seems to be synonymous with a finger wag. So even if it's simply calling it the integrity team or integrity and compliance or I care or all, so one is potentially changing the name, a more friendly logo. Maybe there's a mascot or character or spokesperson. Those are ways to kind of show up differently and go, hey, we're going to do things differently. And we're going to share things that are more in tune with the kind of department that we are, which is we're trying to help and support you, even when you think that we're the office of no. So that's the first thing I do. I would start at, let's look at our brand and how we're coming across to people, because you need to show up differently. And then you got to look at what are the influences of behavior. It's the social environment and the leadership environment. So train less, communicate more. You want your training to be short and impactful and not taking up too much seat time. I would focus most of that training on leadership first and then have them cascade that out. Oh, sorry. You want to interject? What do you got?
I understand the leadership component. I certainly understand middle management and at the bottom component, but how can we, or how can training or communication or even engagement, can it start this processes or does it necessarily have to lead from leaders not talking the talk, but walking the walk?
I mean, it should, I guess my premise is that starting with leaders makes more sense. Almost every program I talk to, they put the foundational training in place that goes out to everybody. And that tends to be a monolith, like one thing goes out to everybody. And then over time, they tend to make that, then they start doing more communications and then they start making the training better. And then they get to ethical leadership training. I'm saying it should be the inverse, that if you were going to spend $1 on training, it should first go to training leaders on their additional responsibilities because they can, it's the program sinks or swims on whether those folks are on board or not. So I would spend more time creating training for leadership and then creating training that leaders can then deploy to their teams. Because most of the impact, ethics compliance, there's a few of you and there's lots of them. So the more that you can get them on board, and then as you use this example for some other thing we were talking about, if you can get them to take ownership over that and play that forward, then they get more buy-in too. So that's why I think if you're changing the culture, you start there.
So, can you talk too much about culture when you truly have a toxic culture that you're trying to change? I'm envisioning every time the leader makes an address, he says a few words about culture. Every meeting opens with some word about culture. People start putting it into their email addresses as taglines. There's a huge effort to do that. Can that effort be overdone? Or if it's a Wells Fargo, it's a FDIC, it's a Boeing, can that actually be impactful to get people thinking about it in their day-to-day work?
Well, you bring up a good point that you're making me think about it. It certainly can work, but only if it's authentic. So this is the tricky part, particularly if you're coming out of something like what they're coming out of. I think the first thing there's this rule in comedy that says things are funny because they're true. Like you have to come from a place of truth. So what I would say is, particularly if you're coming out of a Boeing situation where people do not trust that support system, right? They're aware of it. So you need to talk about that. You need to address the elephant in the room and not be afraid of it and talk about the things that you are doing differently. I think that's maybe the first step if you're coming out of that environment, is to go, this happened. We're putting a new team in place these are the things that we're going to do differently. And we want your help in that. Right. So call out the truth in the room, call out their truth, acknowledge it. And because it can't just be talking the talk, you have to walk the walk. I've seen companies like that are reticent to share all the investigations and bad behavior that's happened in the company. Like they don't want to show that there's bad stuff going on. And I would argue it's better to kind of, in a way that's protective of the innocent and the guilty or whatever, protecting the names of those people. Call out like, this is how many reports we've had on corruption, bribery, conflicts, call out the statistics and say, this stuff kind of happens and we want your help we're not perfect, but we want your help to kind of solve the problem. Feel like you have to call that out. And then the repetition of, you got to earn your keep by having these moments of integrity happening over time. I think then it'll work. But if it feels inauthentic, then it's going to fall on deaf ears.
Ronnie, you have created a lot of content for a lot of customers and clients, many of whom we've had the privilege to visit with on this podcast. These seem to be companies that have mature or maturing compliance programs that want to take things in a little bit different direction, whether it be a bank, pharmaceutical company, food service company, whatever it is, and you've worked with multiples.
Yeah.
It is that type of training, that type of content work for some company that's literally starting at the bottom, or do you have to grow to get to a do it right, Rick?
Oh, you're going to get my bias in this. If you're starting a program, I have some examples of this. I have some companies that are starting from scratch, and I get that you need to have the fundamentals in place, right? The 7 pillars or whatever, we want to have all those things in place. I would argue that it's the same thought process of whether you're starting from scratch or reinventing yourself. And you can reinvent yourself for, it doesn't have to be because something bad happened. You can reinvent yourself because you're like, our program's stale and nobody's paying attention. But the thought process is the same, is show up differently, more positively, more authentically. And if there is a truth about that your from your audience's perspective, it's helpful to call that out, to have that self-awareness. You've heard me do this bit. We have a series in my library, but I've done this on a custom basis for some companies too, called Compliance Confessions. And they're really popular because what we do is we do the Jimmy Kimmel mean tweets thing where we survey compliance officers. We say, tell me all the bad things people say about you. And then we have compliance officers read these bad things, and people recognize it because it's kind of true what people think. And then we debunk it. I don't know if I've gone too far down the rabbit hole here, but the idea is if you're starting a new program, great. You don't have to reinvent yourself, but you should show up positively and in a way that's positive, proactive, helpful, supportive. And I would argue doing that in a way that's entertaining, creative, dare I say fun, is helpful to you, because guess what? They'll pay attention to things that they wouldn't otherwise pay attention to. And people like hanging out with people that they like, what they like. So you're more likely to come ask for your help if they're like, oh, that's Tom. He's the one who sends me he's cool. He laughs at the same things I laugh at, whatever. You know what I mean? To me, it's just it's human nature.
Ronnie, that seems like a good place for us to end this episode on. I hope our listeners will join us again. You want to tell everybody goodbye?
Goodbye, everybody. Have fun. Be positive. Be proactive. It'll help you stay out of trouble.